around the exhibition, Visible Invisible, as rightly told you and I, you could see the kind of registration that has happened, the sign that the conference is timely and meaningful to all of you. So I want to begin by reflecting on my own journey and how it has evolved and why it isn't to now. I was earlier a television journalist with NBC. As you can imagine, there were very few women in the rough ensemble of fun, as that was called when I was into college. But beyond that, I see a huge synergy between what I was doing then and what I'm doing now. Both TV journalism and the museum are really about storytelling, unlocking stories that need to be told and told within a limited time and space. So how do you get to the heart of the matter within a minute or maybe two, which is all that we get in television news? And similarly, how do you convey the essence of an object through a tiny radio? The other aspect, of course, is the importance of the whole team, the network first within. Out in the field in journalism, each one plays their role. It's not only the reporter, it's the cameraman, it's the lighting, it's sound. Everyone has to come together to make it happen. And so too with the museum. The collection department gives you choices, curators visualize shows, the conservation, exhibition design, lighting, installation. All of this needs to work seamlessly together to make magic happen. So in some professions, the interplay between the teams needs to be, or the members, needs to be just far, far greater. And where am I leading to? The fact that my work, our work, is about connecting with people. What we do is directed towards an audience, not talking to ourselves. So it's about seeking exchanges, building networks of information and skills, both within and without, that enable us to forge new alliances between different groups of people, different disciplines, different organizations. It's a realization that I have carried with me over the years and one that drives all that we do at MAC as a team. The museum aims to cater to a broad audience. We say MAC is for everyone and everyone. But we also acknowledge that museums are spaces for and circulation. And this topic is our first foray into the more academic space. The title of the exhibition, Visible and Invisible, Representation of Women in Art through the MAP collection, lays out what we hope to do. At the same time, we're aware that not all forms of arguments or counter-arguments can be unconstitutional justification. So at the core of this intention is the desire to create conversations around feminism, how our community can benefit from. Women over 20s have always come together to provide support to each other, and these formations and alliances have resulted in radical transformations in society. The conference is seen in the light of this coming together and creating alliances, rebuilding older networks while creating newer ones. We are talking about the representation of women in the arts, and it is a subject that has been discovered from several perspectives. But we realize that as a strategy, perhaps newer forms and approaches need to be developed and given voice to, especially in a time of constant change. We see women in leadership roles in many private arts organizations, while most state-funded institutions are still led by men. This gender binary says something about how various institutions perceive gendered politics and why and who they choose to represent. When I first joined the JNS in Mumbai, both the trustees and the advisory board were all men. All of them very supportive, knowledgeable people, but still all men. I was studying the collection at that time, preparing for my first exhibition. And when I artists over the ages, well, not one of them was a woman except for a certain Amrita Scherzer. So women artists had no history to draw from, no context to anchor their work in. It was really hard going, which is why I think this discussion needs to be had even today. Within museum professionals and the art world in general, there's a strong need to let go of silos and find exciting and enriching ways to come together. And I hope this conference provides one such platform to work on building sustainable and fruitful exchanges for everyone involved. Lastly, I would like to thank Archie's curator Anita Azad and Arshad Hakim on planning every little detail of the conference and working so hard to make it happen. The patrons and donors of the museum, Ford Foundation and Sonata Software, for supporting us in the exhibition, the conference, and all the programming around it. And finally, I'd like to thank every one of you for so enthusiastically responding to this invitation and for supporting us in the change that we're trying to make happen. So enjoy the conference and welcome. Thank you, Kamini, for such a warm welcome. Now, Arsha, that a lot of you are in touch with, will introduce you with confidence for this. Arsha,
Thank you. Hello everyone. So, for the introduction to the conference, I thought that I'd start by addressing our biggest question and in terms of decision and taking steps. So, at the end of the day, what would these 2 days be about? And what would we take away from it? While planning for this conference, we went through many ideas that kept circling around artists whose work we enjoyed, felt unsettled by, or were provoked by in some way. What it spoke to us was at the core of what curatory work is and what we try to do at the museum. Respond to artist practices, provocations, and the world that surrounds us. Practice then become a fulcrum, but given the ease and power, we felt that the definition of what we felt that the need for the definition of what is understood by practice needs to expand. We need to broaden our horizons and what we can and unshackle the limitations of what we set ourselves for. What became evident is that practice can't be resorted to just making art, but everything that goes into making art visible. Curatorial work, writing, researching, working with archival material, producing exhibitions, etc. We still felt that we had expanded enough to accommodate various facets of the word practice, but it was still limited within our context. There was still a need felt to expand more, and this led us to think of organizing this practice. Social work, activism, work in community centers, and in public domains. This was the framework we settled with, and then these became the parameters within which we functioned. It also became very apparent very soon that what we were thinking about and going to talk about in the next 2 coming days as a historical question. It has been done before in various ways, from spectacular shows to brilliant essays, to clandestine projects, pop-up shows, and more, which have left a significant mark in public memory. Owing to that, in this introduction now, I will trace out a historical context to 3 moments in time and end with a paradox and a question that has a double bind within itself. Uh, Shilpa, can I have the slide, please? Thank you. Moment 1, formation of the, it's titled 01 Introduction. Thank you. Moment 1, formation of a category, the woman artist. We go back in time to 1978 to an exhibition titled New Contemporary, curated by Ghulam Mohammed Sheikh. The show was held at a time when questions of modernity were debated, New visual idioms were churned and discovered. I quote Ghulam from a catalog text which I read in Geeta Achar's essay, Invisible Chemistry, The Woman Movement and the Indian Woman Artist. Quote, the most distinguishing feature of art of the young, the most distinguishing feature of the art of the younger artist is its growing involvement with local environment. It shifts from generalities to specific interests. This has led to an approach which is more realistic and intimate, a pronounced interest in printmaking, and the emergence of a number of women artists who ought to be recognized as important developments. End quote. The quote and the exhibition creates a category which we now refer to as women artists as this configuration of two identities that's formed only in the second half of the 20th century. What it also foregrounds is the woman artist as a professional category, occurring during a time when women's movement in India was finding its footing, one which led to eventually marking major social change. This category gets further cemented with the traveling exhibition of Arpita Singh, Madhvi Parekh, Nalini Malani, and Reema Sheikh in the late 1980s titled Through the Looking Glass, where gender was the focus of the show. The show traveled through most cities in India, and to quote Nilima from Deepa's essay again, she says, quote, the issue was not about individual opportunities or recognition. It was more a question of investigating the manner in which grouping together as women artists would reposition their individual oeuvres in ways that would meaningfully open up the field. And this formation points to a major lacuna in modernist thinking and practice at the time, where even though visual idioms and cultural forms refused to find new vocabulary, the question of identity only played out in the national stage. This initial pushback to this formation gets subsumed into the larger discourse much later when the women movement gains enough force for art historians to go see, post which, in the mid-80s and 90s, we see a number of exhibitions and essays that are labeled as, quote, women artists at work, unquote, or contemporary women artists in India. The essay Invisible Chemistry begins with an account of Nilima Sheikh's presentation of her work. At, at that point in time, it is framed as romantic and lyrical. She defends herself by folding the political with the personal and asserting that for her, there aren't any such boundaries. And I want to end this section within my introduction by quoting her again, which to me also reads as a feminist way of thinking and being that finds resonances even today, especially within art making. Quote, the inherent pressure to engage with political life of a nascent democracy, where there seemed to be little space left within definitive terms of radicalism, for a quest as personal as the search for a feminine voice. End quote. And with that, I move to the second movement, a destabilized subject. This iconic still from Living on the Margins, 1995, performed at the National Center of Performing Arts, Mumbai, by Rumana Hussain, haunts me. I keep circling back to this image at various points, as for me the associations are very palpable and close. A silent shout of a Muslim woman. The indexical value and the various elements within it compounds the effect. The cut papaya, a fertility symbol. The blurred blue pigment in the background, perhaps thinking about Hindu gods that were painted blue. The slight top angle from which this image is taken shows her to be small, that is minor. A double proposition and a complication is brought forth. A Muslim woman artist who wants to assert herself within the folds of secular nations, but is at odds with becoming the other. Geeta Kapoor, in her essay, Rumana's Question, Is It What You Think, frames her as a destabilized subject that is at odds with the constitutionally secular southern state, and it is and its polemical inclusion in body politics by reasserting her position as a Muslim woman, double marginalization, or the doubly marginalized. Quote, the pressure produced a disjunction. The 1996 exhibition, Home Nation, conflated these two terms to indicate the growing contradiction buried in the promise of belonging. Rumana set herself to the project to try and deconstruct this logic of sectarian discourse, to inhabit its fiction, and to radicalize practice in a way that she may refuse the cumulative force of a ruling ideology. Yet address the poison polemic it infuses in the body politic. Until her death in 1999, Rumana held on to a paradoxical claim. Constitutionally, as an Indian citizen, she would not consent to be the other. But at a moment in history, she would test the limits of political belonging by embodying the deep-to-their subject in what is deemed to be the constitutionally secure sovereign state of India. And what we see is a body politic that gets infused with religious sectarianism, where the question of identity gets doubled and the category of the Muslim woman artist is created. Her ancestry is brought to the fore. In many works, Rumana referenced her own familial history and also created fictional lineages. And representations of the body become more and more dismembered, fractured, which are then in montage with temple doors, mosque domes, and other architectural motifs. Here, the self in its all social and narcissistic forms gets pitched to be scrutinized, and in doing so, social political context within which this self that occupies also gets scrutinized. Moment 3. I'm going to retell a story that ends with riddle. There is a young boy who is academically good, and his headmaster takes notice, a little too much. The headmaster starts calling him post-school hours and they start having sex. He is too young to know what sex is at this point. He's scared. At the same time, he cannot resist his desire to meet him again. He does meet him again, and this goes on for a while. He moves to another school and falls in love with another boy and who sends him love letters. And in one of them, he questions the riddle. He asks the riddle. The riddle is, that which does not grow at birth, what is it that hides it? Which has 6 legs? And what is it at its base? What makes it beautiful? Not able to find the answer, he takes it to his teacher and asks them to kindly help him find the answer. And she gives him an answer. That which does not grow at birth is a tooth. What it is that hides it is arithmetic. That which has 6 legs is a lie. At its base is hair. It is a flower that makes it beautiful. I gave him a kiss, and he gave me flowers. The story and the riddle are from a book titled Our Lives, Our Worlds, telling Arvani life stories edited by A. The story escapes easy traps of being framed as violence, exclusion, or eternal victimhood, as most trans stories do. As trans in queer bodies, we know that there aren't definitive frames to encompass or even verbalize what we go through, from heartbreaks to never-ending gossip sessions to showing up for each other. There are embodied forms that bind us and bind us very closely. I want to return to the question of what the body means in relation to feminism, and keeping in mind non-cis bodies. The ways in which sisterhood and friendship extend in queer communities is far more valuable and enriching, whether there isn't a threat of a body that feels risky, unfamiliar, or one which needs to be shunned away. At the same time, time, for the cis world, the question that constantly gets posed is what kind of affinities does it establish with bodies that it feels threatened by, and what relationships it forms with them. The other then is no longer elsewhere, but within us. The paradoxical question. At the heart of this conference lies a paradox and a question, a double and a double bind within the question. How does the epistemic nature of mapping concede with feminist practice, and to take into account that a feminist standpoint is a standpoint towards resistance, towards patriarchy, towards forms of oppression, and the social and symbolic relations within which they function. And here I want to thank Rajana, who's in the audience, for pointing me towards this paradox. Thank you. A mode of resistance by its nature and by its virtue of resisting does not follow an epistemic logic. The logic that gets followed might be reactionary or tactical, but in most cases is visible. The body becomes the site through which this resistance flows, and by doing so, it gains enough momentum to amass a force that brings us together, that makes us see each other and recognize that even though we might be very, very distant from each other, we have so much common ground that we could build from. The question then is that is there any value in mapping this common ground? Or should we let it remain within the affective realm, where one takes it for granted that the common ground would appear like a messiah, and when it does, we shall adhere to its call. The question and the double bind. If representation was a tactic used early as a form of assertion and as a claim, history, and especially neoliberal history, has shown us otherwise. This assertion gets sucked within the neoliberal logic, and its force of its standpoint or resistance becomes a spectacle that gets monetized. Think of how big conglomerates use identity politics or its language, its values, and power of representation to fast forward their own agendas in order that they can garner more value. And this happens by playing to politics of good optics or good PR. How can we then think of a mode of representation that moves beyond its own identity? Or can there be an identity politic that moves beyond some representation? And if so, what does that achieve? The inherent double bind within this question is of lived experience. A lived reality cannot supersede theories or aesthetic arguments, and that it always, always takes precedence, and that needs to be addressed. And if so, if representation is the only tactic, and if so, is representation the only tactic that we have in our arsenal? To conclude then, if we consider this double bind and the paradox as the empirical tools through which this constellation of contemporary feminist practices gets mapped, how do we shake up the question just enough to let us move away from our cynicism within our social and political affinities? How can we find ways to leverage neoliberal logic and co-opt its own tactics? So it's double cost, you co-opt thing trying to co-opt you. How can we use aesthetic tools in a way that move from the symbolic register to something else in order to leverage what we want to do? And what kind of aesthetic strategies need to be deployed for such occasions? Thank you. And I'd like to move on to our first panel of the day. It's still staying with the trouble, a conversation between Renuka Rajiv and Arnika Aldar. How does one work from doubt? What does it mean to fail or collaborate? And when the world, that is the art world among many other worlds, is product oriented, when the object takes precedence over the process. If complexities are seen as misfits and unwanted disturbances in apparent need for order and categorization, then how can we practice solidarity and coexistence with life? Within this conversation, they try mapping this terrain and why and the works of it. Sorry. In this conversation, forecast some of the questions of the conference by looking at the why and the hows of work and existence. It links the personal, the obvious, the unclear, the fragile, the small, the joyful, and opens up questions that may not be answered but might deserve our attention. Over to you, Derek and Adlika. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Great speech, Bella. Cool. So, first of all, I think we should not have called this a panel because what this is really a loose conversation because may go in all different directions or it may not. And ironically, I think we have prepared and rehearsed and met for this conversation more than I ever prepared for anything. And at the same time, and at the same time, it's like, yeah, just bear with us. This is also out of belief, what because we're really looking forward to talk to each other, with each other about work, um, also in a less formal, in a more intimate environment. And yeah, really, really like that. But from the end of the session, we really appreciate that. I will start. Yeah, now is it audible? Is it fine? Issue?
How about now? Okay. Yeah, no, I live in Bangalore since a while, I guess. Um, I make stuff mostly drawing, stitching, paper mache. Yeah, I guess.
I was really thinking of doing in terms of our research and informing um, my work together with the rest of people absolutely doing workshops together. And I think for me, this consideration is also really important and more than important with each other. What I used to do is scheduling meetups and scheduling. I'm really happy about that because it's going to community. I'm also really happy to see that a lot of the speakers that met before worked together, were thinking about each other, looking at each other's work before. And I think this is also, in a way, how I feel about academic community in this environment of without needing a thank you so much. This is off. Yeah, now it's gone. Cool. Um, yeah, so in a way of working together, of being together, of existing, coexisting in the same world, whether it's the actual world or it's the art world, trying to make sense, trying to disagree, hold space for each other, and also having the difficult conversations. And I know that a lot of you have had these difficult conversations with each other before. And I hope that this conference can become somewhat of a starting point for also difficult conversations, whether they are with ourselves, the people we're working with, or the institution as well. Um, And yeah, I think what we would like to talk about in our brief conversation um, is also working from doubt and what that means, and not being entirely sure of what we are presenting. Um, and it often feels that there's the need of presenting something that is finite, that is entirely thought through, that is perfect, that is ready to be shared with the public. And it's always amazing, it's always great, it's always raising the bar. But we would like to look at this as a workspace where we can also present thoughts that are still in the making and that have not been shared um, with the confidence that is so often expected of us. We would also like to use this as a space for speculation and sharing these, and then telling each other that we don't agree on these. We like to dwell a bit on the pauses and the hesitations in between as well. And when I say in between, then maybe it's good if we talk a little bit about where this conversation started between Renuka and me. And Renuka, do you remember, do you want to talk about the incident that sparked these conversations that we want to touch upon?
Yeah, I guess while we were trying to work out, okay, what should we, what all should we talk about? I guess there's one, during one casual dinner, I guess, after experiment, I know that was no, one screening, and then, filmmaker expressing, what do you say, lack of surety about the work itself, because just being screened, to a large audience and saying, okay, I don't know what this is, I don't know if it's doing something. And then later, I guess it was a different bunch of us who were having dinner, where another filmmaker uh, kind of made the point of, how this person shouldn't have expressed that kind of, lack of confidence so publicly, or, that also as women. And this was an older, I feel like it's relevant to say, in a way, because there are different, what do you say, what do you say, types of feminism, and sometimes that's generational also. So I guess, this filmmaker felt like, okay, it wasn't good for her, and neither may it be, good for other filmmakers, women filmmakers, when this kind of lack of confidence is being, expressed so openly. That perhaps she should have held herself in a certain way and, presented herself differently or something. And I guess, yeah, like somewhere it started from there because, I don't know, I guess maybe we both agree on the fact that, yeah, actually it was great that, this kind of honesty was being presented very, right after the screening, saying, okay, I don't know. Like, it's not like, okay, people make something, you're in it, you're doing, what you can, you try to take the decision you can, but still doesn't mean you know that something is going to be, or is that it was working, perhaps, right? Like, maybe in 10 years, it's a certain idea of the same thing, maybe in 20 years, it's a different idea of the same thing, and this is something that lots of us, I suppose, go through with our own work, with our people's work. And yeah, so I think that's where we started discussing, how like, yeah, maybe doubt is a beautiful thing, and doubt is contains a certain honesty which is important to practice, and it's important to collective, conversations and a sense of, what do you say, creative togetherness, because there is a lot of lack of clarity. I mean, there's a lot of working in gray areas, and it feels a little bit made up to also, constantly present oneself with so much, like, with such a thing that doesn't actually exist, like you have to project this, confidence or closure or, synthesis or whatever. So I don't know, somewhere in the world. But then again, I mean, I think in this context of women, and I can say this, also having seen a lot of it, where it's, there is certain different types of doubt. I think there's a kind of doubt where people, constantly put themselves in this book. Perhaps it's not perhaps, feels pretty gendered. But I guess perhaps there could be this other kind of, culture of doubt, which is, more about inquiry. It's more about questioning them, or it's not settling on something, or it's not presenting something in a kind of, what do you say, performative kind of manner, rather to say, okay, there can be more, that one could delve into. And keep that, yeah, keep going.
No, that's good. Yeah, and I think we were also thinking about who's allowed to represent themselves as doubtful, and who has the confidence to do that. Because I was very quick in that moment to then point at a um, man who was part of this conversation, and I said, but he's not very good at representing himself, and he always like forgets half his things and then fumbles on the stage and so on, and people find it endearing. And then I thought, okay, now I basically just contradicted myself in a way as well, because um, I think what the person was pointing out, um, that the filmmaker should have presented herself better, was also she was coming from a point where she took it in a personal way, and where she had kind of like um, grown up in a world where she had to represent herself in a certain way to be heard by people and to be acknowledged, to be seen as somebody who's professional, who knows what she's doing. Um, while the man I was pointing at potentially lives in a world where it's endearing and sweet if he doesn't present well. And I think we were talking about this later as well, how the institution, for example, the museum, in the end, is a male idea. It's a colonial project. And at the same time, even if you look at this museum, the majority of people working here are women. And at the same time, we do have to present ourselves, our ideas, our exhibitions, our programming, education, everything we do here, in a way that we are extremely confident about it. And sometimes I miss that space, where you can go back and then say, okay, I'm actually not so sure whether this worked out well or not, and can we try this again? Can we just do the whole thing again? But you always have to carry forward, and you're just finishing one project and then the next one is already starting. So this moment of doubt then eventually exists more in conversations between friends and, in the evening hours after you come back from work, and then you can actually say, I'm not so sure if that was really so good. So I think that's a space that we also share. Um,
But I think in say, okay, maybe outside an institutional context, or perhaps, okay, say in, smaller coming together, maybe, I don't know. I think it is possible to operate differently, but then there is so much influence of, more, so-called model, or, like, where, you have to operate in a certain kind of way, and actually you don't. You can do things, you can, um, say, I mean, bring a show together where it's like saying, okay, I don't fully understand what it's about, or we don't fully, it's, I mean, and in the sense of articulation. But I mean, it's possible to do it. I think perhaps more of it should happen, or, maybe there should be more of a culture of just trying things out. I mean, I know it's happening, but it could be less bothered about the image of it. Can be.
I was I was also wondering if I could ask you, because Renuka's work is in the Visible and Visible exhibition on the fourth floor. And I was like, I saw you making the work. I saw it at different stages, and now it's hanging in the exhibition space. And I'm wondering if your relationship to the work has changed, how you feel about this, the moment of the work being at your home or your family's home on the floor, the dog is around, and you're stitching away, and you're telling me, oh, don't treat it like it's so precious. This is just it. But it's now hanging there, and there's, like, people are being told to keep distance, and it's certainly not being touched, and so on. But what happens for you in this moment of transition, of the work coming from home, going into the exhibition space, and has your relationship changed?
No, I think with something like this, or, in a different situation, say, okay, someone buys a work of me, then I'm like, why? Actually, I mean, it's maybe I look at the pictures of the work or something, and I think with that particular work also because it's a commission. I mean, if I'm very honest, I'm not so sure it's as I would have liked it to be. Perhaps if the process could have developed differently, or if it so I'm actually still thinking about it, feeling like shit. It's in a museum, and I'm not so sure about the work. Like because somewhere it is one thing to say, okay, like the idea, or the like I can even enjoy the idea that I want to work towards, but then it still doesn't happen in that kind of a way. So I think I'm in that phase where I'm like, I don't want to look at it, or I don't want to think about it. Um, I'm not sure of it, to be very frank.
Yeah, and I think we were also talking about practice and production in a way of like whatever you make today. And I was asking you whether that was like different in art college or how things have changed. But that basically now you're at a point, and many other artists as well, where you have to constantly produce, and everything what you're doing is going to be out there and is going to be seen by people. So the moment for experimentation, failure, and so on is shifting as well. Um, would you want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh, it's funny because I think even from early on, I was putting stuff out there, but I think it's different when you are putting stuff out there, and then maybe it's a much smaller and very different group of people who come to see it. Largely so friends or personal networks or something. And I think that putting it out there because I think it was way more incessant on my part actually in the beginning. But I think that had a very different spirit to now this feeling of like, oh, is it good, or like, but in this really like unhelpful way. And somewhere I think in the process of making it's nice when it's possible to forget about that. And I think that happens, with, and in my case, I think it was enough making, or enough time spent, or enough time had in a way before something can come together. Um, but then I mean it's like pros and cons also. Like I also feel grateful to not have to constantly, come up with stuff in a way where and then I'm like, okay, do I have to do something? I don't know. But on that level, I guess there's not a pure space, and maybe that's also what I'm coming to terms with. And it's saying, okay, yeah, there are pressures, and I am in a privileged position not to have to do certain things. So actually, I'm cool to go with the mind fuck of certain other things that I'm going with. So, I don't know, but
Yeah, and that also makes me think about the relationship between the artist and the institution. And often it's this one-off situation. You commission one work, you ask somebody to give one talk, one workshop, and then you move on because as an institution, you're also asked and supposed to represent as many artists as possible. You want diversity and so on. And at the same time, I think what I'm interested in personally and where I'm coming from is building long term relationships with people. Um, and I think I know this also from the past, from institutions who invited me to work with them, um, that they kept calling me back in a way. And I, over the years, really started to appreciating them because it was a sort of relationship that was formed. And only when you come back again and again and again, you also feel like you have the space of like saying, okay, I don't like what you're doing here, or I would want to be part of that, or I have an idea for you of something that could be done. So this, what I would really like to change is this one off, but rather look at long term relationships with people we're working with. And at the same time, that comes close to something like a friendship, then, or even another ship. mentorship or whatever it is, in a way, or relationship, whatever. um, but and then you're being looked at from the outside again in a way as like somebody, oh god, are they just working with friends now? Have they this like closely knit small community of people they're reaching out, and they're not letting other people in anymore? So you're also finding yourself in this situation where you're wondering, how do I do both? How do I grow this group of people I'm working with? How do I keep those close who are interested in working over a long time?
You're saying that like specifically from working from an institution like that.
Yeah, I think that's how I used to look at the institution when I was outside, that I would appreciate institutions who are doing that. And now I realize within the institution that this is something that I would like to do, that I would like to focus on. Yeah. I think I would also like to talk a little bit about representation. I think representation is always, like Kamini mentioned it in her introduction, Ashat was talking about it a little bit. And at the same time, I think I've shared that with my team many times, that I have a lot of problems with the idea of representation. Um, at the same time, it's in the title of my PhD. It's in the title of the show that you find upstairs. So it's something that also doesn't go away, but where I would like to share that I'm, yeah, really at odds with it in many ways. And I think Zarina from the White Pube has written this many years ago, and I keep coming back to it. But she wrote that the issue with representation is that it does not seek to overhaul, change, disrupt, or dismantle, rather to preserve, to move within the current structures that exist, that it recognizes as broken, exploitative, and oppressive, and expects busted frameworks. It does not look to change for all, only for a few. It believes in exceptionalism. The institution ensures its survival at all costs by absorbing the critique that it hits it, because it can point to a few success stories that have conformed to its requirements. And she goes on later to say that representation is a gesture to a never fulfilled promise. And even while I'm reading out this quote, asking myself if I'm co opting and appropriating something here while I'm sitting within the institution and talk about the issue of representation. Um, but at the same time, she also later says in her writing that um, representation as a starting point is, it's an incredibly powerful moment. Um, but at the same time, the question remains, where do we go from here? And how do we move forward if we have reached that moment of representation? Um, how do we hand over? How do we um, work quietly, withdraw a little bit? How do we move in the back and then let other people take over in a way? And I think that's something that over we keep thinking about as well. And I wanted to ask you how. Wow, this, yeah, this is nice actually. How do you feel about working quietly, or what does it mean to you, if at all?
I don't know if I work quietly. I'd say I work alone and with maybe not much need for like what do you say infrastructure or something. But um, no, because I'm thinking of friends who work way more quietly. It's also like truly not truly, but there's enough motivation to make work because they have to, and I'm not sure. I think I am way more attention seeking from the work point of view. But then the quietness, I mean, in one sense, in this time of say, okay, there is so much language and noise. I think it's also not to disregard it entirely, but then around work, it's like how certain um, practices or certain topics are being framed, and then it's the framing itself which becomes the what do you say, the reason or something. And that noise, again, I mean, I can only speak for myself that I think I don't want that noise around my work. That way, I want the quietness, for the work to be itself, if possible, whatever that means. Mm. But for it to have a chance, I think, to, for someone to experience it, and okay, maybe they don't think much of it, or okay, maybe they have their own response to it, but yeah, somewhere this thing of telling, I feel like it's some moment where at least, okay, on the one hand, I'm reading, like, what do you say, bios of people or of their project or something, like, I don't even understand what's being said. But then on the other hand, it's kind of like saying, okay, there is so much text and, speak around it. Um, yeah, I think that quietness I would like to try protect from my work or something. Maybe, because it feels like, yeah, I mean, the reason to, work in certain mediums or work in a certain discipline is because, yeah, maybe, um, this communication is not happening through, say, an essay or, an academic format or, something, right? So then it's also like saying, okay, that medium requires a certain space for experience also. And maybe that's the quietness. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think for me, in quietness is also quietness allows a lot more space for care. And I think at the end of the day, this is what I would like to yeah, bring to this conference. Ask all of you to bring to this conference and perhaps take away from it. Um, Looking out for each other and caring for each other's work, practice, state of mind, health, and all of these things. And yeah, I think that's all from us, unless you want to say
No, no, no,
something else.
no, no.
I
And
think
we've overshot. I think we've overshot the 2 minutes.
Renuka's dying to get off the stage.
It's not so bad.
But yeah, thank you so much. And over to the next.
Uh, speak, speak loud. Okay, so firstly, apologies for the tech glitches. It's a very new auditorium in a very, very new building, and everybody's getting used to it. But we go ahead, and on the note of caring, our next panel is titled On Feminist Curating, Identity, Control, and Reach. I'll read out a short text and introduce the panelists. Curatorial practices get often framed within modalities of care. For the artwork, the artist get a part of the exhibition, the institution, and as a social responsibility for the curators to engage with audiences. If caring is the primary task, then what are the various facets of it? And how does caring move from the interpersonal to the social? Can there be a feminist way of caring and curating? And if so, what does that exhibition look like? How are curatorial choices made while taking into account multiple positionalities and perspectives? Within the largest modus operandi of curating an exhibition, the question of control looms large. Who controls what the exhibition is about? What is curatorial identity? And how does that play out? Is it with the selection of artists, the question of funding, of access, both physically and intellectually, or what role does language play within curatorial text, and how can it expand to accommodate everyone instead of the very few who are part of the art world? The panel on feminist curating addresses these questions with three key nodes on by the question of by questioning ideas of curatorial control and thinking of its counterpoint, what would it mean to let go, curatorially speaking? To whom or what control is transferred to? What becomes of the production and how one And how does one fund such collections? What residues remain? Are they conversations, websites, documentations, or none? Adjoining to this talk, who are exhibitions made for and who has access to exhibitions? What does the audience use this? Does the exhibition function as a provocation, an aesthetic delight, or as a spectacle? Our panelists are Sajana Kaikini, and please tell me if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Uh, Sajana's work spans across curatorial, artistic, and philosophical domains. She's currently working on a forthcoming book on curatorial philosophy with Rutledge and teaches as an assistant professor of philosophy at SIAS, their university campus. Uh, yes, we welcome the panelists on the floor. The screen is still glitching, but please back up. Our next panelist, Pramoda, who is a researcher, writer, and curator based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. She has been the assistant curator, education and public programs at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Sri Lanka since its inception in 2019. And we have Virangana, who is an independent curator, writer based in India. He is interested in the ways interdisciplinary forms and creative practices merge in order to create dialogues in public and private spaces, and the convergence of images across disciplines. She's curated Future Landing, the art show, at the Serendipity Art Festival in 2002. The floor is yours.
Hello.
Thank you, Arshad and Arnika, and thank you, Matt, for hosting this conference and for having all of us here. I'm just going to pick up from, and the way we are doing this is more in the form of a conversation rather than having it as a moderated panel, so it's quite organic. We like to begin with this idea of the loss of control and also pull from what Arnika and Renuka, both of you were talking about, with this element of doubt which comes in, but also allowing for, with this loss of control, not necessarily arriving at a finished end. And with future landing, we play the slides in a loop, so I think with all three of our projects, you'd see them running in the background. When future landing, I was invited to curate this during the 2020 Serendipity Arts Festival, which is just before the pandemic. And when the pandemic hit, we didn't know whether we were going to be able to move into physical space, and the virtual became something that we were then thinking of working with. But this idea of uncertainty is something that carried forward. And rather than have to control what we were going to show, which is also in a way how we think about curating, is how specifically one navigates a space, what comes in when you experience something. With Future Landing, it was also questioning what it meant to let go of control, questioning what it meant to let um, artists have a platform where they decided what went up when things changed, but also arriving at a space that was constantly changing. And no matter who experienced it, it was always different because it was based on what your sound was for Faramula's work. It was based on images and the speed at which you chose to select images for the packets work. With Nepal Picture Library, it was a collage that kept changing and you could create your own storyboard. With Studio Oliomengus, there were games that they were adding constantly, so but you could only move in a linear format and not go back. And with Abhinay Koparzi, depending on who logged in from which part of the world, it picked up different tonalities in the background and created new compositions. So I was learning what was happening along with the artist creating the work. And at some point, there were these questions of whether it was a strong way of controlling things, but it was also, in a way of letting go with trust. And that's something I think which we'll also be talking about before we move forward in discussing how it picks up on this idea of experience too.
Yeah, I mean, thanks Arshad also for that sort of a book because we've been meeting over some. 2 months, and each time the conversation has been different. So we have nothing to present as Arnika was suggesting. But something that I sort of notice amongst our practices, and we've been sharing quite a bit, is that there seems to be no object. I mean, it's an old, it's a 60s line. The object is dead, but really there is no object that we are sort of engaging with. But at the same time, if we are doing curatorial work and that work involves some labor, there is something that we are working with. There is some dough that we are eating, some chapati we are making. So what is that dough? And that was sort of, that's the probe I think that all of us are sort of taking forward. And it's so nice to hear about future landings. It reminds me of the show that I did done long ago, Vectors of Kinship, where also the main sort of the driving impulse was the object is an unstable entity. It's sort of a complex, and the whole idea was trying to arrive at a curatorial gesture than having any kind of a show. And we have sort of objects that sort of form around conversations, histories, memories, people talking. So it's sort of a infinite loop sometimes that we're trying to just give you a crystal moment or an insight into. And so we aren't talking about pointing out and saying the story tells us about this anymore. We are interested, perhaps, I mean, I would talk about it as a transcendental impulse. As much as we're talking about lived experience, the resistance to not be tagged as this or that is something that I think is a shared sentiment we feel constantly amidst working in the previous generations as well. And so, and thinking about that, Pramoda's work is around talks, is around conversations itself. So, I mean, do you want to take on?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Matt, for flying me from Sri Lanka. Thank you, Ashad, and everybody else who's been very hospitable to me. It's been a long time since I've traveled abroad, so it's been very nice. Um, so, yes, speaking of letting go, I work at at an institution, and my curatorial experience has been primarily that. And when it comes to institutions, I think that came up when Arnika was speaking too. Um, how much space do we have in terms of letting go? Um, and I've been thinking about this a lot ever since we've been planning the talk also. I don't work as an exhibition maker. I work in museum education. And at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art Sri Lanka, I was given the title curator, and I asked, "Whoa, um, sorry, is there something happening? Am I supposed to make exhibitions now?" And they said, "No. This is primarily, I mean, ideas of our chief curator, Shamini Pereira, and as an education-focused museum, education is works alongside exhibitions, and that's why I'm a curator. And um, it's education is alongside exhibitions, and we've also been questioning this idea: is the identity of a curator so bound with an institution too? And I personally have been given a lot of space in the programs that I have curated. So the exhibition that just ended, it's been on for more than a year. It was not supposed to be on for that long, but given the situation in Sri Lanka, we extended it twice. And so we are trying to build an institutional identity of what a curator does. We have a curator of learning and training, for example. And what does that mean? Because her primary focus is thinking about professional development in museums and in the art industry, and that does not exist in Sri Lanka. That's so beyond um, a normal person's thinking. Even being a curator is beyond that. So that's what we've primarily been thinking of, and particularly in terms of institution building, it's a difficult question to answer. and but it's something that we've always been thinking about, and that much I am very confident about. And but however, I want to say that letting go when it comes to public programs at the museum happens at several stages. The first one is when an exhibition is curated, and I work in outreach too, which means I'm always in touch with school and university curricula. And our previous exhibition had artists like George Keat and Senaka Senanayaka, who are very well known locally and internationally. And there's a reason I'm mentioning their names to an international audience too, because everyone knows them. But what we realized was that the curriculum is really struggling. They don't study a single woman artist in schools, not even at advanced level stages. And they also don't study, they study only one living artist. He's also in his 80s. So he did work with the 43 group and the artists that we all talk about all the time. So the exhibition was in a way for us to curate programs around these artists, but to also go beyond. We also realized in the exhibition that there were only two women artists. So programming, if you look back, some of the events that I have curated have most of them been around discussing um, womanhood and femininity through various angles, and that has been quite exciting in a way. And I'm hoping some of the images are playing. You'll find captions that describe the events. So that is one stage of letting go. Another stage of letting go is I often work with external resource people to uh, to produce these events, and I let go at a particular point when I speak to them and I tell them this is my objective. This is our objective of doing this talk, doing this workshop, doing this performance, film screening, whatever it may be. And at that point, it's a relationship that gets built between the institution that I represent and the resource person, and that in itself is a bit it's a letting go. I trust you. Let's now work on the event that we all have to work together to produce. Yeah, I think in institutions, like I said before, it's complicated letting go, especially when it's an institution that is very new. The museum opened only in 2013, 2019, sorry, just to give some context. Yeah. Oh, super. Yeah. And we work with, I mean, we've come to the question of infrastructure. But you can see, um, this is an artist who is in the exhibition. This is Nelun Haraskama, whose work is right there. And that's Shamini. We work with very less, like very limited infrastructure, very limited logistics also. So this all our talks, we don't have an auditorium like this. Everything happens in the gallery space. But we'll come to that point a bit later, I think. Yeah.
I think one of the things which you brought up and connecting this idea of the subject and the object is how the audience comes in, because so much of what is experienced in what we put out there is based on how audience are taking it away, and it sort of is a dead space which we enter and then we activate it through the memory in which we're experiencing it, and it eventually becomes these different narratives that we take away, even though it may be guided in some sense. And especially, I think when you're working with an audience that is coming in to experience artists for the first time or learn about things in an educational form, there's a certain responsibility that we have in how we are sharing things too.
Just reminds, maybe I'll just take a moment to talk about the show that we did for the opening of the National Center for Biological Sciences. It's in Bangalore, and the archives open. So the opening exhibition, I collaborated with an architect and a philosopher of biology, and it was a very interesting. It's again an opportunity to curate a different kind of object, which is an archive, and curating archives is as volatile as you can, because you're making that story, you're making history. It's a very powerful. at the same time a very futile kind of endeavor. And again, working on curatorial gestures, for example, we decided we'll turn the whole thing into a blackboard as a gesture. So the whole archive is like a blackboard. Walls are all painted black. There's chalk everywhere. So anyone who comes in can write on it, can scribble on it. And we began by scribbling the first line. So it it often happens that it's not enough to have the gesture out there, but it's also you need someone to lead it in, lead the kind of engagement that one would want to hope for. If you're trying to create new kinds of models or new kinds of infrastructures, especially within the curatorial domain, and yeah, so new kinds of vocabulary are now emerging, like the curatorial complex is one. Apart from exhibition as that unit that we engaged with, and exhibition histories, complexes, hospitable environments, conviviality spaces, ideas of cook. So now, ideas of cooking together, eating together. Now, these are modes that are actually hackneyed in the European context. If you look at it, Europe has done to death the lunch and coming together, but I mean, we do it in a different format. It's not within an institutional format. So the way in which institutions run here are also a very unique creature, I would say. And so when we talk about public-private partnership, or it's a very different beast. You can't have the same level of understanding when you're doing it at a global level. So that's why I think there's also that sort of a uncharted territory where we are also making the kind of vocabulary then we are trying to then propagate. So we are making the textbooks for ourselves and we're going on. And I'm not valorizing that infrastructure is absent and therefore we're doing great romantic work. But we're in between. We're almost always caught in between. Either we're trying to catch up or we're way ahead. And then we're trying to sort of make sense to people. So, I mean, and the contemporary captures that tussle. We're neither in the past, we're neither in the future, we're sort of in between. And I think as sort of growing practitioners, I mean, now I think in my practice, I want to think more and write more than do more. And then sort of want the doing to be fed in by all the thinking. This is something that again I brought it back, sort of sort of again bringing back some thoughts. Chantal Mouffe is someone we engaged with actively during our MA, agonisms, healthy agonism, and it's about uh, having this sort of sort of a very sort of a convivial space to say no, I don't agree, and then we sort of go out and have tea, and sort of also a way in which we are um, the word essentialist identities, right? So that's why it's sort of I just put it in there. Um, it's it, the two words sort of deeply at the problematic of this whole. I mean, when you're trying to construct a feminist way, which is akin with the humanist and the post-humanist, essentialism itself should be. I mean, that is the problem. When the word essence comes into the picture, then it's I would say it's against the feminist grain because um, I mean at the most I'm sort of now more and more interested in a transcendental feminism, feminism that's not again about having certain presences, having certain representations of course, but making present all the newnesses that we don't even know about, the comfort with the unknown, for example, the comfort with something that we are yet to engage with. And I love that we began with doubt. So, doubt is always for the philosopher. We go Descartes, we teach doubt, skepticism, and Rene Descartes, the classic, the bourgeoisie French sitting in his fireplace. But here we're sort of, activating doubt in a very sort of fresh framework. So that's great. And then, I mean, generally thinking about uh, working with this sort of volatile infrastructure and creating the spaces and units that we are then talking about or struggling to speak about. Uh, we have to talk about how we talk about these things. Then something that with that came up with Arshad was how while we have art criticism, I mean, we don't have enough program that trains students in exhibition criticism or curatorial criticism. The criticisms or the writings that talk about the things that talk, enable art. So it's not just the object is not just located within the artwork. It's about the framework. How is an anthology edited, for example? How does this whole festival come together? So, I mean, having these conversations would be something that we should sort of strive for, especially at I think college levels, university levels, programming. I mean, students even don't know that these programs exist. Um, and we want to talk about the programs that
No, I mean, I was really excited to hear that many students had signed up for this conference, for example, because in Colombo, I really struggle to often get students to visit. But I think beyond that, speaking of criticism, in Sri Lanka, the art world is so niche and so contracted to a group of people. Um, and we do speak of accessibility, we do speak of all of those things, but criticism is really lacking. And it's so interesting. I've recently been going through some of the newspaper articles that were produced when the 43 group, that is Lionel Wendt, George Keat, all of them, they were producing their exhibitions and they did everything on their own. Um, and a lot of it is really interesting criticism and just being published in a newspaper. But today, what in Sri Lanka, what we are seeing is that even the sometimes the events that I do and put a lot of thought and work into, they turn into social and networking moments, and sometimes it's quite heartbreaking. But they also turn into kind of like a collector's world, even though it might be a not-for-profit space. Um, it's very easy for programs to turn into things like that. And yes, so I'm actively working towards breaking those patterns and making sure active critique, engaged, nuanced, insightful critique happens. And I don't think even the exhibition we had, which is called Encounters for more than a year, I think I saw only one piece of writing that had engaged with the curatorial concept rather than going into speaking of each artist in the exhibition. So yeah, that's yeah, quite bleak, but yes, I'm hoping Virangana has something better to add.
No, I think this idea of becoming an enabler, and I was just looking at the last line in Shajna's slide of when does a moment begin to feel significant? And we are talking about the process of what it might mean to just think through um, curating as a way of actually working through arriving at looking in some way. Because when we talk about exhibition making and talk about what it means to put something out there and this connection with the audience comes in, it's also in a way where we're looking for these moments for them to take away. And it may seem a bit far-fetched, but something I've been exploring in curatorial practice with the course that I teach is this idea of the punctum coming in, which Bart talks about with stadium and punctum, more in relation to photography. But if we were to apply that within a curatorial practice and where the exhibition without an audience or without activation is really a dead space, but we arrive at these moments which are layered with our memories, which are layered with our experiences, and how do we then allow for these moments to become those significant elements that carry forward, and for each of us, how that may become that punctuation, become that moment that we want to arrive at wanting to come back to something again. And it's also maybe working towards a process that allows for that space to exist where trust exists, where uh, we allow for another to enter our spaces to then walk away with an experience which may be very different from what we anticipated it to be.
and whether that's something that we can start building towards in the structure of um, holding the solidarity.
Actually beautifully segues into what we talked about, how people change. I thought I said, it's a cue. Do we change at all after this seminar? Are we changing as people? Are we going out there as refreshed new kind of? So the way in which we look at identity, for example, is that floating, fluid, changing identity. Because an art space, a space that can hold art, can hold a floating identity by per se. So art has hopefully the power to transform. And so then if we are sort of working with this whole experiential domain of the arts and talking about it, or sort of even framing it for that point of time, for that purpose, or letting go as that radical gesture. And even the letting go is not an ahistorical one. Like we let go after knowing why we're letting go, and that would be that conscious letting go, uh, which is very different from winging it, which is a different format altogether. But within this format, I think because we are mediating, there is this curatorial work happening, some labor is happening. So the question is, does anything change at all? And I would hope to have some kind of a transformative potential for any curatorial work. You go in and you come out. One new idea is enough, but we have to strive for that a little bit. Just push at the wall sometimes and break it. And uh, yeah, so the idea of transformation is something that's sort of very much, and again, going back to this whole vectors of kinship project, uh, the way in which basically staying, like the first panel, staying with something, like they stayed with the trouble, staying with the process, will open up this way of just recognizing one moment where I, it's basically that beautiful moment when night becomes dawn. You never know that moment, but it happens, and you always missed it. But it happens.
Happen, and then it's like a slow motion
Yeah,
process, and then coming back to realize it, which is why you want to return to it over and over again.
exactly. But it takes place. These thresholds take place in our lived experiences, and that's what we're trying to grab at, I think, and remind maybe again and again. This threshold happened. That threshold happened, and so that's something that fascinates me. Would you want to?
Definitely. I mean, in museum education, art education, the whole point is to believe that we can change audiences. Um, so yes, in the previous exhibition we did, we had 135 public programs, which is a lot of events. But I mean, looking back, I can definitely remember moments that that threshold was very visible. Um, like I think there's a photograph of the event here, where we did a performance of by a group of young students about menstruation and conversations about the rituals that happen alongside a girl's first menstruation in Sri Lanka. And the response to that was overwhelmingly positive. And I don't know if that would have happened at another event. So I keep thinking back, why why did I want to do this performance in the museum, and why was it in front of a particular artwork, for example? And even I just wanted to show. Um, so our, yes, yes. So our first exhibition had to be cut short because of COVID. And then we kept thinking, oh my God, but there were so many artworks that we could have learned from, that we could have given more to the audience, given more memories, like Virangana said. And that's when we decided to work on a series of online learning materials that we published on our website. Our website is being revamped, but I'm thinking they're still up there. So I'll show you one. This was done by Sandev Handy, who is a curator, and he has chosen two artworks to speak about. That is one by W.J.G. Billing from the 43 group, and another by Mohanad Khader, who is a contemporary artist, and talk about just looking out the window and drawing what you see out of the window. So these are very simple activities designed with 8 to 13-year-olds in mind. But of course, anyone is welcome to print these out at home and do them. So that's where I think we really went and actively thought about that threshold and that memory that people can take away. Because having an exhibition cut short because of something like COVID was very difficult. And even these materials, it took us more than 6 months to develop because they were all translated. We do everything in all three languages. Um, so, yeah, you can see they have certain learning outcomes. So this is Sunday's narrative about how he sees the two artworks. And I think on the other side are the learning outcomes or the objectives.
Your hand and thinking of how what another thing that you're talking about was the residues of exhibitions. And one is that we collect archives, we're constantly producing to try and remember, or we're creating takeaways, and what that really means. And again, with coming back to future landing, a recent conversation I had with somebody who wanted to write on it asked for images, asked for a way of which they could look at the artworks. That's something that we had decided, given that future landing was always arriving at change, we chose not to archive it. We chose not to have an online version which we could go back to and look at. And it was so difficult to grasp because everything that you're trying to do is save and hold and keep forever and make precious in some way, which also Rinka you spoke about. And this idea of preciousness and where it comes in and how we make things precious just by creating this archive, just by feeding something in and building all this text around it, building it. But then rather than that, in that moment, what does it mean to, again, coming back to memory and experience, hold that individual memory, hold that individual experience, which cannot be documented, which cannot be carried forward, and still then let go. And this also brings me to another conversation I had with another photographer who's making a book right now, but working with a box of found images. But then thinking of what would it mean to put those images out there without holding them back, and how difficult it was. It is to think of saying, okay, these are how many images we have, these are how many editions of the book we make, but there's nothing beyond that. That's the end of it. There's no, that's the residue that you are sort of distributing back and letting go of this preciousness which has become an archive, and what that might mean when we talk about just accumulating data in this.
At the same time, uh, it is writing a different kind of. It is writing itself and then eating itself. So it's sort of an autophagia, it's sort of autophagy, right? So, but you have created a model, and I think that's what. I mean, somehow I feel like curatorial work is always sort of creating models and new methods in a way, which is also counterintuitive because suddenly at the moment we say method, it's sort of constricting. But I mean, here the academically speaking, like there are methods to do things. Like there are methods. You need to paint. There is a method to do it. You need to engrave. There is a method. You need to be trained in. So speaking of that, then perhaps there is a compendium of feminist methods, and I'm sure we have amazing practitioners amidst us. And I've mentioned Meenakshi's work, and I'm going to say the method of risk, for example, risk taking, just pushing an envelope where the feminine is not always equated with care. You've taken a risk and doubt yourself, right? So there are a lot of beautiful bhakti poems, for example. They talk about just sort of, eating themselves in. And sort of a method of just risking everything in order to push at something new. And it's very different from, let's say, how artistry would look at feminist work. and feminism in the curatorial work will be revivalism, revisionary histories. So those were the frameworks that we still teach and we learn. But at the same time, the propositional as the feminist movement, the transcendental is not so much explored, I feel, because always lived experience becomes our refuge. We keep on talking a lot about lived experience, but in order for what is something that also constantly needs to be foregrounded. So, what would the curatorial commitment be? This is some. This is the concept that I sort of constantly keep talking about. The commitment of that work then guides whatever the afterlife of it is or not. Right. So, if it's a hedonist commitment, there is no afterlife. So, yeah. But what is the afterlife of your work?
The exhibition, we had a catalog, and then the second one, we decided not to print one purely because printing costs in Sri Lanka have skyrocketed. And then people kept asking, but I need something to remember this exhibition by. And what we kept saying was, it's all there in front of you. It's all derived from the experience, and that's the memory you create of the space. And yes, commitment is extremely important, and that's how I view my work as well. And it's most, I mean, I can take from an example. There was a tour that I did once for a group of students from an international school coming from a very, very privileged background. And they were about Anoli Pereira's series, I Let My Hair Loose, which I believe are in the exhibition, Visible, Invisible. So when I was doing this, I mean, they were primary school students, and what I realized was I am telling them a story about the artworks. I am telling them the story about how enfranchisement happened in Sri Lanka in relation to women, and I'm also telling them how class, um, as a as an area, has evolved because now class is becoming less obvious in the country. But what I realized while doing the tour was that these kids might not remember, or they are not taking notes. While a university student, I might expect to take notes. But a 10-year-old, maybe not. They remember the artist's name. Um, but even that is a memory to take home. And sometimes the tactile, the obvious, the visible is not needed. What we need is that experience to be, and that's what activation can sometimes achieve. Yeah, so that's I think what I have to add. Um, Let me check my notes if I've written something. No, but I don't think so. Yes, but I do think that yes, I've written something more. The publication is important. If if there is a possibility to do it, I think it's something that can be looked at. Um, but in exhibitions, I think it's also okay to, like Virangana did, to decide not to archive because that's again a method of looking at things and doing curating.
So I think taking from that, when we moved Future Landing into physical space, which was totally anti the model which we planned it to be for this Renfree Arts Festival last year, it was where each of these five artists could choose who they wanted to invite to take over their virtual space, but then all 10 of them were in the physical space. And again, trying to keep change constant. So it was very difficult to document it because most of it was based on experience. But what was interesting is that while during the pandemic, each of these experiences, which made them subjective, were happening within everyone's homes. Over here with Future Landing, it was with the packet entity and Tashiana with the Office of Mass Resignation. When the moment people realized that they got this certificate based on the form they filled up, how performance became a way of acquiring these recipes of what they could take away.
So suddenly it was, oh, we fill up this form, we get a certificate of whether we've been accepted or rejected. Or then let's see which certificate we want, fill out a form number. Or then with Farah's work, it was again whether people walking in, when you sort of lose yourself in that space where you suddenly realize your work is reacting to how you speak or how much noise you made. And there were people in there performing to the work with and asking if people take videos of that performing because that became their way of taking away a memory. So also how I think these spaces end up creating or inventing new ways of remembrance in some way, and how we let go of this um, identity of this performance that we put up in a public and a private space, and what it is with works, with the way we encounter spaces, that we are allowing ourselves to let those guards down, to uh, become our childish selves again in some way, but also free ourselves in what we otherwise are constantly trying to hold back.
So we open this up to the audience. Any thoughts that are floating through? I mean, we have some more ideas and experience, but then it'd be nice to, yeah, Rashmi.
something which perhaps try to also work towards is to avoid lazy voyeurism in some way, because the reason that we also visit and we look is if we for everybody talk about something, we want to go and see it. But then how much time do you spend engaging with it, looking at it, and then what modes of programming or exhibition making do we work with to avoid this very fast way of saying, okay, you've ticked the box, you've seen it, but actually engage with it and spend time and taken away some kind of meaning with it. I think it's maybe working towards that somewhere.
I mean, the more this is from my very, very interesting set of experiences at Hebar Gallery in Manipal. Pushpamala was there for that. To just start a gallery with a bunch of sort of, they're local carpenters. We wanted to get Hebar's paintings framed, and this carpenter came in and very nicely wanted to saw off the painting to fit the frame. And there was no way of convincing him that he can't saw off the painting. I was trying to find ways, and I was like intuitively, I just said, "This costs so many." I didn't know the money, the cost of it, but this costs a lot of money. Don't touch it. Okay, we did. So then we changed the frame for the painting. So I noticed there's a very subtle thing that we just shifted or paid some attention to the value that exists in staying. And for my students, for example, basically some time spent in being equally excited about the value of the work and staying there, and that maybe makes the 2 hour traffic worth it. That that I think it's also that transactional thing, that value of it. Sometimes it's just like, oh, what, like it's like 3 hours Bangalore traffic, go there and heartbreak or nothing or what. So or you're just not able to understand what that value is, that you're not able to access it. And so access, maybe the work, the curatorial work, is getting more infrared x-ray vision into the value that sort of underlies. And there's a lot of work that the artist has put in, that labor, to try to understand that kind of labor, how many hours. These days they have these saris that they sell which says 100 hours of labor work put in. Just that small tag suddenly puts things in perspective. So I'm trying to see these very pragmatic ways, because I've had such experience, very disappointing experiences. Most museum experiences are basically equal to foot pain for me. Like my feet ache, and that's all that remains. Why should it happen that way? Why should we aim to finish a museum in one day? So small gestures, maybe to just reorient in the educational space, would be the beginning, I guess. Yeah.
No, I agree completely. We are still working towards um, um, getting, I think getting people in is the first step. And sometimes I've done workshops on botanical drawing because the display was focusing on nature and environment and man's relationship with nature. And I would ask myself, oh my God, are people going to come to this? And one thing is that the educational experience is that they learn the skill of botanical drawing, and we approach it as no one in the workshop knows botanical drawing. They're all amateurs, but of course the person conducting the workshop is an expert. But then they come to learn the skill of botanical drawing, and they end up looking at the works, looking at the 100 hours of labor by the artist that has gone into creating the work, and go home remembering that. And that, I think, is another way of simply changing that perspective, simply making sure that the 3 hour drive was worth it. Colombo traffic is a little bit better than Bangalore traffic, but I've not even spent 24 hours here, so I don't think I'm the best judge of it. But yes, it's bad either way. Um, so even when a school group comes in, a 10-year-old, if they remember George Keith's name, that's achievement enough. They don't need to remember um, Cubism, they don't need to remember Picasso, they don't need to remember any of that. If they remember his name and that he made paintings, I think I would be extremely happy. Maybe in 50 years in Sri Lanka, I think we might be able to get to a place where people move even more, even further, and are not scared to look at art, not scared, not intimidated by spaces as art. Any other questions?
It's okay then. Since we're talking about accessibility and how we're also addressing to it, I'm wondering how artists, or if it's even thought about that your hours of work is not necessarily accessible for all people. For example, even when I walk around here and I see an ISL interpreter right now, there's not a lot of ISL interpreters that are present in different museums. And MEP is one of the few museums where I've seen tactile art that is accessible for people with visual impairment. So just wanted to know what your thoughts and opinions on that is.
Um, bec- I mean, I can see a lot of progress at MAC here today. Um, and when it comes to accessibility with visual impairment, unfortunately, at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art Sri Lanka, we've not been able to do much. But in our next exhibition, we are taking a step forward, um, and having sound and that support available. We also have, I think, docents can play a really important role there. We have trained, we call them visit educators because they're not just like security guards, because they are there for engagement with visitors. And I think another important factor is to think about the physical space and how accessible or inaccessible that it can be. The museum, we don't have a, MMC Sri Lanka doesn't have a permanent location. So our first location was in a very corporate focused tower on the 17th floor. And it was very difficult getting people inside. Then we moved to a mall and we realized, oh my God, this makes such a huge difference. But it's a bit of a headache sometimes because I have to go and tell them, can you switch off the mall music before we start an event? But that's the only issue. Um, and I think while definitely need to speak of and cater to people with visual impairment and any other kind of disability, and I've had people attend programs and they're neurodivergent, they're autistic, and they struggle to follow what's happening. And honestly, I feel like it's still a long way to go, because we still don't have the infrastructures that perhaps museums in the Western world have. Um, but in small ways, again, we can cater to accessibility and make sure that they too feel included in the work that we do.
Yeah, in addition to what Nora said, which is basically at policy levels also, make a lot of difference. You just put it in the policy. This is a non-negotiable. If there is no RAM, this place will not open. That is a very strong way in which we enable or sort of ensure that there is the access remains at all levels. And yeah, I mean, actually reading a lot more around concepts, idea of trip time, for example, slowing down, concept that will enable not accessibility being like an add-on, but a general way of being. Because I don't know who amongst us is not. I mean, is so-called quote unquote normal. We all need different ways in which like access has to be part of that sort of a commitment of that institution, I would say. So, for design, for example, whoever we hire as architects or designers need to be sort of tuned into that. they all the small decisions eventually lead up to one ramp missing or no. So I think paying attention would really matter to these points. But it's sort of a big piece, but it has to begin already. It should have begun a longer time ago, but it has to begin.
Just talking about audience, I feel like post liberalization, and particularly with art, there's been such a strong emphasis on the so called art market. And it's actually a way to, what happened was actually artists, we all started doing very directly political work around that time of liberalization, which was also the time of rising communalization, And I feel like this is my theory that all these corporate guys who really started taking over the press, they started, projecting art as only in terms of the market. All articles were about the market. And what happened was that there was something, a wonderful thing called, which we all cribbed about, called the art reviewer, the art review. That completely disappeared. I think in Bangalore, and the people held out till quite late. Where there are actually art reviews, which people used to flip about, but actually everyone used to read. And I remember we used to get like between the Kannada and English papers, like practically 20 write-ups whenever we had shows, And people would go and, of course, and also review every show. So that was a kind of a medium between the audience or the people and the artist, which has completely disappeared. There's no reviews at all if you notice. So what is there is called lifestyle. So it comes in lifestyle. And I've had several TV people, calling me at one point, who said like, we want to come and interview you. I said, who's going to interview me? So they said, oh, we have a group of 4 or 5 people, and we will interview you. I said, but does anyone know about art? I said, no, 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 we are in general, so it's again, it comes under lifestyle, and it comes in the afternoon. Lifestyle is in the afternoon. So what has happened is this, this kind of general dumbing down has happened generally everywhere, but somehow particularly with visual art. In fact, just yesterday I was having a conversation, or this morning, with some people in my apartment block where I've been living there for 10 years. And this young woman, very friendly, she said, oh, what do you do and all that? I said, I'm an artist. So she said, theater. So normally people think artist means TV, serial, or people who act in TV serials, or theater, not even theater. People are not even aware of theater. So it's become a complete dumbing down where nobody knows, and people don't read literature. People don't read anything serious. So there's a kind of dumbing down, and that's also the problem. But I think also, I mean, having, I'm also a curator myself, so I always think of the audience, and many times I find the audience, even myself as the audience, need to be guided around a show, so that one thing leads to the other, and it all starts adding up, in terms of the concept or whatever, your experience. But sometimes what you find is that there's one work next to it which is completely different, doesn't make sense. So that kind of, I think that's one of the things that one has to think about while curating.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to hear all of the references you make and just the way that you guys are having this conversation. And I wanted to just come back a little bit in all of your understanding of care, and especially in there's that question in here about different positionalities and perspectives. And when you are, I think this idea of curating and also the curator really came about in that very neoliberal moment as an independent curator. We didn't necessarily think about curators within museums in India, right? Because growing up, there are plenty of museums, different kinds of museums, in any city that you grow up in, but they're like government run or public, and you kind of walk in and see like cobwebs on some Gandhara sculpture, and like it's like it was such a strange experience, but also you knew of the. I mean, you didn't necessarily aspire to work there, but there was something
it's a very different experience from walking into a museum if you're growing up in Europe or North America or something, right? But the curatorial essentially, and especially, it came up also as a position of power, because I know that when I started to work here, whether you want it or not, power is lent to you if you say you're a curator as opposed to an artist, or in relation sometimes. And sometimes you're an artist curator, because artists have always had to kind of create their own spaces sometimes, right? Because uh, there didn't exist a space for them to sort of show their work, so you could curate in an apartment, or you just organize yourselves. So I'm just wondering that now, seeing the different kinds of shifts that have been happening over the last couple of years in relation to all of these questions about audience, for example. I know I've worked briefly in institutions, and it's always fascinating to see the people who are working there, because they come from different class intersections, caste intersections, and there is knowledge, right? Like, knowledge exists from everyone's lived experiences. So in what ways do you bring that into the way that you work and take care of people, both within the institution, um, and those who are invited in, and also related to funding, one last layer to that is that majority of the institutions here are run by private individuals with a lot of wealth, right? And so even if we talk about policy and we talk about inclusion, the way that that money flows is not necessarily a very democratic process, or and so I'm just wondering how in your experiences you've negotiated ideas like care or risk, in like maybe like a little bit more on that, it would be kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I'm not, there's no straight answer. All that Meenakshi said, and thanks for some your comments. If you want to, I mean, we need more morning and evening spaces for art, more afternoons. But yeah, I mean, I faced a very direct occasion of a very last minute censorship of a work. This was during the Shanghai Biennial, and this is Meena Kandasami's poetry reading. She's reading about at the memorial for Rohit Vemula, and this is from that. And I sort of wanted to project her just reading, and she's screaming her poems. And it was not a headphone thing. It was located. It was in a corridor and supposed to be screaming through the corridor. And so the point of objection was the content of it. It was there was India mentioned in it. There was very radical stance against India mentioned in it. It's a poem, yeah. And so, as a curatorial team, for example, there were two strategies. How would we do this? Like, and this was after I go there for the installation that they say, oh, this is what the censorship team. I mean, they're known for their censorship team there. I mean, not just the internet, but here. But then one way of doing, I sort of first stance was head on. I'll keep the screen blank. We will say that this is not being shown. You know. Then I realized that, but that's an absence. It's not serving the process. It's not serving the purpose. One that present somehow there. So subversion was an easy way. So I just chose another poem that she talked about language, and it's about it's a different thing, but it's in similar, just the same anger. She talked about language. I had to substitute it for that and play it, for example. So that's something that via subversion, I realized the commitment was something else. So I shouldn't sort of lose the smaller battle for the bigger, win. Those kinds of things, we definitely have to make a lot of choices, I'm sure, in our practices if we want to take risks and say what we have to say. And yeah, I mean, in terms of the whole idea of working with institution as a paradigm, it's give and take, hot and cold. It's a dance, but at the same time, because because I know I teach ontology, metaphysics, it's very hard to not
So you need that institution to fight against. You need the object to break it. You need that wall to go through. You need the ceiling to break it. One more ceiling will come, and one more ceiling will come, and you keep on breaking it. So that sort of that keeps the momentum up, I guess. I mean, very abstractly speaking. But, yeah.
To add to that, I think with programming in particular, something I've realized is that with funders, footfall, the number of people who attend the exhibition, the number of people who visit a museum, an event, these things are really important. And at, in, through the work that I do, something I've really taken risks on is just sometimes putting something up, even if no one would attend it, because I trust in its quality, I trust in the work that I do, and in the back of my head, I'm hoping someone will attend. But the point is to take that risk, and sometimes that may not appease a funder, they may not like it. But yeah, even within, I mean, while working in an institution, I felt like I've taken such risks and been able to somehow work with funders. But also, I think with the work that we do, we need to constantly up the quality, and that means taking risks and working with censorship or against censorship, against the grain, and that's important that we continue to do that. Um,
I think just picking up from what you said about where curating started and cura as a word just meaning care to start off with, um, and how that changed the dynamic of the independent curator coming in and this power that was just almost inherited with that. But to push back conversation, which I do have with artists, obviously working themselves used against me very often, is that they're also in a place to see the world. They're in a place to also make choices. And I think that this idea of where power comes in to just be selected for an exhibition, to be approached and say you can invite it, and where there's a lot of advantage uh, that gets taken, especially younger artists, and something which you realize that was happening a lot. And with Art Chain India, which I now help out with, we are working towards putting out certain formats of unsigned contracts, putting out information more that things are negotiable. I think all of these things which you almost take for granted, saying if you're invited, you just say yes, regardless of what these things are, but opening up that conversation and seeing how important that is. Um, Coming to audiences, I feel it's also important to research depending on again where the exhibition is to see who your audiences are. For instance, for a show I worked on in Abu Dhabi in 2009, we had to consciously remove the mortality reviews number of figures we had because we've been told beforehand that is something we can't do. There will be objection to that. And there was a work by K.G. Subramanian in the exhibition, which had a very small. I mean, we hadn't even looked at it because I think that doesn't register sometimes. Where but we had people come out and point it out to us, and we could shift it to the back because there were so many people who noticed that tiny corner where there was a very it was a very graphic illustration. When you do think of it, and you realize how the audience responds to something which is very different based on cultures and how that becomes an element of care too. The third point you brought up was with institutions and funding. And I think this happened a lot in the pandemic, that spaces which were either CSR funded or had funding come in, started giving grants and creating opportunities for artists. That's something we started with a space there program called Space Studio and Artist Grant, but I think there's always a dearth of those because there's so many applications that come in that it's always a requirement you need more of that to come in. So,
Uh,
it's, I mean, not just audiences. My parents want to know what curation is. So it's not an, I mean, and I can't even point to an exhibition and say, oh, these are the artworks I've chosen. So that makes my definition of curation even more difficult. But I think one thing is to make them understand how significant art is, and because I work with education, I would take tangible examples of how art can facilitate learning at, and learning very broadly taken. How can we learn a simple fact, but also learn more about the world, about the social, political, economic issues that happen. Um, I think that's how I go about it, but it's not easy. I think I filter according to who I'm talking to. But yes, there are many people, and I've also been approached by people who have basically curated the whole program for me and ask, oh, can we have the space to do this? And that's again a challenge to tell them, I'm sorry, but it, it's a collaborative process, and it's not a venue. So just to make that distinction clear has also been a bit difficult through my work. Yeah.
In different languages other than English, to kind of build vocabulary and also build discourse around some of these terms. So, uh, and I'm just in your Sri Lankan context, if there is something that's coming up, are there any possibilities that you see?
Yes, of
Uh,
course. So at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art Sri Lanka, when the moment we started working towards it, we wanted everything to be in all three languages. If you go to a commercial gallery in Sri Lanka, you realize everything is in English. And English is not an official language in the country. It's a link language, which I won't get into to talk about. In our constitution, it's the link language. But yeah, I mean, it's a way of the government coping with the years of conflict that the country has had between Sinhala speaking and Tamil speaking communities. And we wanted everything to be in all three languages. But the moment we started translating even the exhibition, the artwork captions, we realized there are no equivalent words in Sinhala and Tamil. And I speak Sinhala quite fluently. That's my first language. But I speak English all the time now, and I feel really sad because I have to start talking in Sinhala to be able to do it in Sinhala to make people engage in Sinhala. So that is very difficult. So what at the museum, I used to do editorial work up until very recently, and now I've handed it over to someone else. And we started working on a glossary because no one can help us other than ourselves. So we started setting a standard for ourselves, and I looked at the captions that are coming up in our next exhibition, and there was a point where I started feeling really emotional reading a Sinhala caption, and then I realized we've done something right because if I'm primarily speaking in English, but I'm reading a Sinhala caption and I'm feeling that emotion as much as I would, or even more than I would while reading the English, that means we've accomplished something right. But it's very, very difficult. Um, and also in Sri Lanka, there's no art history discourse. It's all just Western. We speak still in that same language. Yeah.
So, hi, I'm here. Um, One of the ways I've understood curation is creation of a space and taking that very literally. Uh, we deal with architecture, we deal with places and spaces, and they definitely become a space for the dialogue to happen between the art and the audience. Architecture is also equally guilty of exclusion at the most visible levels. So,
your approach to curation and to the politics of architecture is something that I'm very curious about. How do you deal from one city to the other? Because all three of you are experienced, or you have been working in very different kind of political contexts.
I think with reference to architecture, a white cube space is probably the easiest to work with. But personally, I enjoy that challenge of a space that's raw, a space that invites you to make that a part of how you experience. And the history of the space becomes something, it doesn't necessarily always become a part of the exhibition, but it becomes a way of perhaps creating a narrative where you can't just isolate the works when you're working in a space that is outside of just four white walls. Um, so that's how I like to think about approaching it, because definitely, and also the reason why we create partitions in exhibitions, the way when you enter a space, that navigation of how, when you experience one thing after the other, which Pushpamala also brought up, that just saying the order in which you may encounter the work, the conversations between the work themselves, and how you work with the architecture to create that narrative is something which I think we just end up working through beyond just a floor plan, but also with the history of the space, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's extremely critical. Design is part of. I think if there is any curatorial pedagogy, design should be part of that pedagogy, because that's where the power comes in. You're actually leading people to go and take that right and go left. You're putting 100 steps, so you're avoiding an 8-year-old woman from, with arthritis climbing it. So these are decisions definitely that, and so the white cube and the black cube, the opaque spaces. I mean, they help as they were committed to the works and the way in which the work should ideally be seen, right? But at the same time, it's literally like basically entering a biology lab, I would say, and looking at a slide. Yeah, you need a preparation. You need to have wear gloves if you need to wear gloves if you don't want to contaminate that specimen. That same way we enter an art lab, which is a gallery space, if that is the case. But there's also the field. The biologists also go out and work with the environment, and art works with the world. Like the environment definitely comes in. So I mean, for example, Bharat Bhavan, I like Korea's sort of places where there are lots of cross views and there are uh, meandering times. There are windows as much as there are walls. So these are small gestures that architects definitely put a lot of thought into. Like if you're a student, to get a project that is around designing a museum is like the most exciting project we could hope for. Um, because it's sort of designing the experience of that space. How high the ceiling is, how low the ceiling is matters. I went to see the Van Gogh 360 immersive. Why? The ceiling was so low and it was not immersive because it was just you could see the ceiling more than the projection. And so it was just not doing just in Bombay. I don't know. Hopefully in other cities they will do it in a better way. But eventually, that is maybe where it also crumbles. If the design doesn't hold, it can do great injustice to the work. It has to be just fully designed and safe. And lots of new practices, social design collaborators, they're doing a lot of work. And I think meaningful work happens when you acknowledge that it's about the unbuilt space more than the built space and architectural design, especially. So,
So I'm going to try and throw out a provocation, if I may. And it really comes from what Arshad said in his opening remarks, and Admita, and what you have also at the very beginning said about your panel. That is that your interest really as a group came together because all of you are really interested in a non-object based practice, a process based practice. But then my provocation also comes from, I think, what you said about the Rohit Vemula piece being removed from the Shanghai Biennale, because now you have a moment in history where groups, communities, genders that have not been represented are seeking representation. So on the one hand, we have a situation here where we are saying that we representation is not important, objecthood of art is not important. But that's the position that most marginalized communities have actually been in. If you read, for instance, Anne McClintock's essay on imperial leather, the whole book really is about how women's labor was largely about erasing traces of labor. They went about domestic work, cleaning floors, doing washing, etc. Because it was always about removing traces of labor that had come into the domestic space, right? And similarly, when you look at craft groups, and we just spoke about how today visibilizing the labor by saying so many hours of labor have gone into the production of this work. Are we saying here that a feminist practice has to then be about this idea of erasure, which has already been claiming their labor? Or do we now think about feminist practice also about a kind of a visibilization that is necessary for a particular historical moment?
Thank you. Because definitely, I mean, that is the whole revivalist or revisionist mode of making the gaps visible. And the gaps are endless. There are so many that haven't yet been seen or sort of made visible. The the non-object part is where I think within the feminist discourse there is, I mean, I don't know how to put it in words. Like the feminist experience should ideally not be pawnable. You can't shouldn't be pawning it as a this is because that would undo its sort of crux that so that's objectifying itself. That is what I think when we're looking at process, the resistance of objectifying itself, like the other thought that I had put, subject resists unconcealment, is unconcealment is this idea that Heidegger brings. I mean, you know his critical history. Unconcealment, somebody should come there, go and unconceal it for them, and then that subject is revealed. That paradigm sometimes happens, but that shouldn't happen. I feel like the subject should be present. So, a politics of presencing and not discovering. Maybe that would be something like a simple shift in vocabulary, because that will also resist simplification of the feminist discourse. That's the problem with the feminist discourse. It gets simplified, and it's easy for someone to dismiss it. And I find it weird, and I find it still like, how can someone easily dismiss this? How is it not uh, very evident that you can't dismiss this? But we find dismissals all the time, and so I'm wondering why that dismissal could happen. It's maybe this whole thing where it's okay, this is what it is. The more we resist, this is what it is. Perhaps that, so that would be the approach that I would take in terms of like paying attention to the process rather than the object, because it's very easy to move over objects. I feel like uh, even once the presencing has happened, it's easy to move over it. And so, how do we not move on? Like keep on. It's okay to keep on coming back to it. So maybe that could be an attempt at negotiating this whole idea of objects within the feminist practice. Yeah, I don't know. It's a half-baked thought.
I think just to add to that, also the residues that this process brings in, because even if it's not just arriving at an end of what it might be, but the process and how one might experience it, or how these residues become signifiers in some way of something that's taking place, or something that's been experienced, and how that carries forward into becoming something else. And that perhaps has a longer impact, rather than just that one moment in which you experience the object.
Hi. Thank you so much for this lovely conversation. I just wanted to ask something that we were discussing from the beginning about access in terms of when like audiences or non-art audiences or people outside of the art world, when they kind of visit these spaces, how they interact with kind of the language that's given to them. and that gives them access to the work. Like when you mentioned, like there's a tag on the sari that says it is took 100 hours to make, and this the language is very simple. Like anybody who can read or understand English can grasp, like it's a quantifiable, or it's a simple concept. Um, Whereas when it comes to art, there are a lot of abstract concepts, and we often use this complex language. And the question is also like when you have a space like this in a mall, where like it's kind of radical because it becomes like, oh, I'm going to the mall to shop, but okay, guys, I'm also seeing some contemporary art. And then when people with that kind of mindset enter and they are like met with sort of difficult language, like, I'm curious to know, like, what do you think of that, and how could that be?
That's a really interesting question. I do think that it's to have engaging, accessible people present inside the space. And so at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art Sri Lanka, what we have done is all our docents, we call them visit educators, and they're non-art people. We don't actively go and look for art history students, fine art students. They can work if they want to, but we actively look for people beyond that. So we have business management students, um, engineering students. So they do come with a background that's not related to art. Sometimes the museum is the first art space that they've encountered themselves. So they do know what it is to come into that space and feel like, oh my God, I don't understand anything. So the by having them present, that's how we would um, make sure that a visitor who doesn't know anything about art or those abstract concepts in like how they would engage with it. Um, and when it comes to our curatorial staff that do guided tours and engage with visitors quite often, what we also do is to make sure that we ask questions from the visitor in front of us so that we don't feel like so that we are not alienating them. So we try to understand if it's a group of university students studying fashion design, what are they studying at this moment? And is there any way in which they can engage? They can engage. That's why their teacher has brought them in to see the exhibition. But we need to understand for ourselves what are the ways in which they can engage, and that becomes the entry point. And when it's a curated exhibition, also, we actively think about the social, cultural, political, economic issues that are in the exhibition. And that is also those are also very interesting entry points to go into because it doesn't matter if they've come to the mall to I don't know, hang out with a friend and have coffee, but they would still be interested in knowing about what has happened to Sri Lanka and its debt crisis. So the artwork becomes a way in which they would engage with the debt crisis, another way in which they would approach that, another way in which they would learn about that. So I think that's the way we would, we've so far worked on it. And it's been very good because there are sometimes I once had a visitor who came in. This is an MFA group, by the way. They do study visual art and masters in fine art also. And there was a whole discussion happening amongst the group of students. I had finished the tour, and it was about womanhood and how an artist had depicted how difficult it is to be a woman in Sri Lanka. And there was another student in the group that said, "No, but I mean, there are women who smoke these days, so these things shouldn't be problems now. It's easy to be a woman." And I let the students have their conversation because they were adults and they could talk about it. If it were a younger group, there's a way in which we would moderate that conversation. And it was interesting to see how they moderated it amongst themselves. But if it were a younger group, I think we would approach it quite differently. We would say we need to look back at history. Today, I've encountered kids who have never seen their mothers wear a sari, but we have artworks talking about oppression and through the sari as an object. So there's a way in which we would approach that conversation, talking about the history of living as a woman in Sri Lanka. And sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there. But just wanted to say that there's a way in which there are many ways in which we can achieve that objective. Yeah.
without necessarily simplifying or dumbing it down. And difficult language is good for people. You need to stay with difficult language, figure it out. That's the whole learning process. You learn more, otherwise you'll not learn anything. So really, it's okay. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there are these walkthrough. There are different ways in which you engage with the social design dynamic to bring the people in, and then engage with it. You bring a friend along as a program that you can have. Like these kinds of very creative sort of ways of thinking about it. Usually, it's because that you bring a friend along once for a museum visit, and then that friend knows nothing, and then suddenly you know a lot after that, or they just sort of get a taste of it. It's like I wouldn't say it's that difficult from tasting a new cuisine. Suddenly, never had stepped into a Thai restaurant much later, and then suddenly tasting Thai curry. What does it mean? So, I mean, if we look at it that way, access could be a very creative sort of project to take up for students as well. Rambling on.
On the note of tasting, I'm sure all our stomachs are like, where's the food? But before that, can we have a huge round of applause for the panel? Um, it's it's been a really, really enriching conversation, and thank you. Just some housekeeping announcements. Lunch coupons are available on the registration desk. Please collect your coupons. Lunch is being served on the fifth floor. You can either take the lift or climb the stairs. Thank you, and see you in an hour.